Rob Bertholf here in part 6 of the Last Generation Theology series, and this one's going to require a bit of a tangent to understand why there's so much confusion right now on this topic. More specifically, what's the motivation of the people causing so much confusion? What's the motivation behind questioning our doctrines? And I think the motivation behind confusion is actually linked to questions on doctrines. More specifically, the history behind the book, Questions on Doctrines. And I think the driving motivation behind why it was written in the first place, which requires us to immerse ourselves in the mindset of the people at the time, and more specifically, understand what questions were being asked, and why did we feel compelled to answer them. And the answer you'll find comes from Eternity magazine, which asks, are Seventh-day Adventists even Christians? To understand this better, we need to see the timeline of things and how Donald Barnhouse was reached out to by T.E. Unruh regarding affirming the evangelical character of Adventist doctrine. It seems like he also sent even a book, Steps to Christ, to Barnhouse, which he then created a new article, which he says false in all parts, bearing the mark of counterfeit, and called the Adventist a cult. More than that, he then reached out to Martin to write a full book on Adventists, expanding his earlier cult chapter. And by 1955, Martin had nearly completed the manuscript of his book on cults entitled The Rise of Cults, listing Seventh-day Adventism in the Big Five. But Martin, wanting to be fair, insisted on interviewing all the Adventist leaders. And March 1955 starts the first of this evangelical Adventist conferences between Martin and the GC Field Secretaries Froom, Reed, with Unruh moderating, and later Ministry magazine editor Anderson joins. And they started to go through all the different doctrinal questions that made them seem like a cult. Well, what we find is that they polished over a lot of it and backtracked on things. And we see then in a new article by Ministry magazine in 1956 saying in the past 3 years, the evangelical leaders have come to a new attitude to Seventh-day Adventist Church. A remarkable change, since it consists of moving Seventh-day Adventists, into my opinion, out of the list of anti-Christian and into those who are brethren. So what changed? What was the big change that brought them in? And what we're going to find is that these group of delegates had turned their back on the pioneer beliefs, saying that the work was finished at the cross, Jesus is not doing anything in the most holy place now. Further, that Jesus did not have our nature, but had a sinless nature. And immediately it was perceived that Adventism were strenuously denying certain doctrinal positions which they had been previously attributed to them. They did not want to be seen as a cult, so much so that they were willing to follow after the things to make for peace. But Jesus did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Ellen White tells us real peace can never be secured by compromising principle, and no man can be true to principle without exacting opposition. But Froom and others did not want to be seen as a cult and wandered into this ecumenical fellowship. So they published a book, Questions on Doctrines, which stated that there was a involuntary sin, unfallen nature of Christ, atonement completed in the cross, salvation by justification alone, and the imperfectibility of the Christian character. And this is largely what is being taught in many of our universities today. Now, this book, Questions on Doctrine, which was written by Froom, Reed, and Anderson, helped really be that bridge for the Protestants to accept Adventists as their own. And in return, they published a book in 1960 on the truth about Seventh-day Adventists, where they cleared Adventism name, saying that we went with the leaders and they all agree on this new stance of theirs. But not everyone agreed. In fact, it created an uproar in the Adventist community with those who felt that, it questioned and did not accurately represent Adventist theology and the writings of Ellen White. In fact, no other book has aroused so much controversy than Questions on Doctrines. M.L. Andreasen, a theologian and author of the Sanctuary Doctrine, saw the book as the most subtle and dangerous error and a most dangerous heresy. And for this, the church revoked his ministerial credentials in 1961. Now, there was a lot of really good research done in that time period by Russell Stanish, Dr. Ralph Larson, and others. And in their research and analysis, they found that Questions on Doctrines had largely changed many undisputed previously viewpoints. For nearly a century, not a single author had ever promoted the error of Christ possessed an unfallen human nature. To the contrary, Sister White for over 400 times upheld Christ's fallen nature and in about 800 articles. Clearly, until the 1950s, these doctrines were widely accepted in God's church. But we are warned that in the latter times, some will depart from the faith. And this is where the lesson typically ends. But I think that's where the lesson should actually start, is why? There's something missing in this story. There has to be something, because it's so simple, right? Jesus took our fallen nature in order that there's a link between humanity and divinity. It's right there. How do you dispute that? But it's disputed so heavily, there has to be a reason for such intense pushback. And in the last lesson, I hinted where this pushback is coming from and ultimately who it's coming from. General Conference Bulletin, the papacy built this up. They needed Mary to be born immaculate, or it challenges the absolute sinlessness of Mary. But why is it important that Mary be born immaculate? You got to go to the formula first. So the Holy Spirit, who's obviously sinless, plus a human, the Virgin Mary, equals Jesus. So if Jesus has our sinful nature, that means Mary must also have our sinful nature. Guys, if you understand this, you'll understand the entire argument. This goes against the Catholic belief that Mary remained free from sin. And this viewpoint of theirs, right, that Christ was completely untouched for sin because his mother Mary was not touched by sin. That's where this comes from, guys. It's all about Mary, not Christ. You're like, well, why is that? We're going to get into it. But understand that this idea was rooted in Catholicism, not in Adventist doctrine. Catholicism needs Jesus to have a sinless nature, so that way Mary can have a sinless nature, and that's their whole piece. But the Bible is explicitly clear. God sent his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh. Again, we see it so clear in Hebrews. Paul says, for he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. So this is not a doctrinal thing. Right? We're not having a doctrinal conversation. If you're locked into this, there's something much deeper that you're holding on to. Ellen White says very clearly that Jesus took fallen man's nature. And so what is it? Why could they not accept this? What position is damaged? And we're going to find it's all in the Catholic doctrines. Christ wished to be tempted by an enemy, but he could not in the flesh. This is the same exact positioning parroted by some of our Adventist so-called theologians, that he was tempted, but only from the outside. He has no inner compulsion of sin. And they used this Vatican talking point that Jesus was not only sinless, but in fact incapable of sin. He could not sin. But that's not what Ellen White says. Ellen White's very clear that he could. So where is this coming from? It's coming straight in the mouth of Babylon. The official and infallible doctrine of the Immaculate Conception states that the Virgin Mary, in the instant of her conception, preserved free from all stain and original sin. And here we see the original heresy, right? Is that it's being now carried forward in the Protestant churches, who have not purged these false teachings, who are still very much wrapped into the Catholic mind. But what's the implication? Without this, she would not be able to be involved in our salvation, as the Catholics incorrectly state. And this comes from the Second Vatican Council, that our salvation is due to her constant intercession, not of Christ. Therefore, the Blessed Virgin, right, invoked by the Church under the titles of her advocate, and also our mediatrix. We find that Mary is by the side of the throne of God, above all the angels and the saints. She's the one who's continuously asking for that mediation. But Timothy is very clear that only one mediator, and that's the man, the human, Jesus Christ. So let's pause real quick, right? Where are we going with this? Because if you're like me a few years ago, none of this made sense. And like, why are we having this conversation? I don't understand what the big deal about Mary being sinless is. I don't understand why Mary needs to be our mediatrix. So why does the Catholic Church need this narrative so bad? Why is Mary so important to them? And this is going to take a second to explain. Got to hang with me if you want to understand it. It's going to require a quick history lesson. So remember that Jesus ascended to heaven, right? This is the early Christian church started spreading like wildfire. And in the first 300 years, the early Christian church extended to almost all of the known world. In fact, we find that the Neronian persecution tried to stifle this, blaming the Christians for the fire in Rome. Nero instigated persecution primarily in the city of Rome, but all over Italy, and many of the early Christian church pioneers died. Then we see how in 95 we push into Domitian's persecution. This is where they tried to kill John but couldn't, so they exiled him to Patmos. And again, they're now calling Christians atheists and killing them. So if you didn't believe their system, then you're an atheist. We then see in 250 Decian's persecution, where now they're forcing Christians into pagan sacrifice. We move into the 303 to 313, where pagan Rome is now trying to just erase Christianity entirely. And the bodies are piling up, but it's not working. And this is where Constantine comes in the scene. So in 306, he's proclaimed Augustus by his father's troops, right? Hang in there. I promise this is going to make sense soon. Just hang in there. So in 312, Constantine wins this big battle, and he sees this sign in the heavens, which is actually the sign of Nimrod. We can get into that later. But what's interesting is that he starts to align himself with the Christian cause, which gives him this massive political sway. And now, rather than persecuting Christians, he now becomes the protector of Christianity. And that was the Edict of Milan in 313. But not long after that, he declares himself the sun god, right? Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and even puts out a national Sunday law. So you see where this all goes. Not long after Constantine establishes this imperial Christianity and changes the date for Sabbath, he also changes the date for Easter, starting it on a pagan spring festival rather than on the biblical Sabbath. And in fact, everything gets replaced. Christianity becomes the established religion in the Roman Empire, and it took the place of paganism, and it essentially just rebranded it. They call it baptized paganism. The new Christians were the same old pagans. Their surge in the church did not wipe out paganism. In fact, they were just baptizing them. So it meant that paganism had diluted what was Christianity. And this is what we see in Revelation chapter 2 about the doctrine of Balaam. So understanding this, Catholicism is baptized paganism labeled Christianity. In fact, we see this, right out of history books, how the Pantheon in Rome was once a temple dedicated to the Roman gods, and then it was converted to dedicated to Mary. So when it was used to be dedicated to Venus, now it's to Mary. In fact, they did this with most of these churches. And what's interesting is that we see how each pagan temple became a Catholic church. And the former temple of Venus is now the temple of Mary. So now we start seeing a connection between Venus and Mary, right? We also see a connection between Isis, Minerva, and Mary. This pattern is not accidental. Pagan goddess sanctuaries, right, are systematically redirected to Mary. In fact, we see how many of the images of the early, of Isis nursing the baby have influenced the Christian artists who depict the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. Why? Because they're talking about the same person. So Isis depicted as the Virgin Mary. They're just replacing Semiramis and Tammuz with Mary and Jesus. In fact, we find that throughout all of the different cultures, the Virgin Mary is rebranded from a lineage of people before it. Each culture, same figure. In Rome, it was Venus. In Greece, Aphrodite. In Canaan, Ashtaroth. Right? We see how each of these find their name actually even in the Bible. In the Bible, she's called the Queen of Heaven. We find this, how they're making cakes to Semiramis. Her name is actually found in Judges. They forsook the Lord, called him by name here, and her, Ashtaroth, and her husband, Baal, Nimrod, were being worshipped. We find that the Cush, right, begat Nimrod. So this is the great-grandson of Noah. He's the one that created the Tower of Babel, right? He's also the grandson of the rebellious Ham, whose genealogy continues down. And Nimrod is this mighty hunter. He creates all these different cities. In fact, he even wants to create the Tower of Babel. But God confused that language and scattered them. And so Nimrod's plans were ruined, but the movement was not. He was still founding these cities, and his cult began growing rapidly until he died. Now, the Bible doesn't say how he died, but we do learn that Semiramis was just as ambitious as Nimrod. And here's the big issue. So she had no legitimate heir to power, and her base was really fragile. So she did what most ancient rulers do, which was turning to myth-making. And she said that Nimrod had gone to the sun, and the rays of the sun impregnated her with a child. This is the origin of sun worship, and this is why Mary / Semiramis is so important to the Catholic Church, which is a lineage of Zoroastrianism, or lineage of Mithra. So, in reality, she actually got her soldier pregnant and then killed him. But what we find is that Semiramis now has this little boy, and this is Tammuz. And they see that he looks like a tiny little, the sun, when it's at the smallest, the winter solstice, was also his birthday, December 25th. It looks like, a tiny little god. So what we call Christmas, it's not the birth of Jesus, it's actually the birth of Tammuz. That's who Christmas is worshiping. Sure, hate me in the comments because I read history. The point is that she becomes the Egyptian Isis, Tammuz becomes Horus, and now the immortalized Nimrod is Osiris. And this is the foundation of sun worship. Now, I go much deeper into this. I had to cut a lot out in order to fit it in this piece. I just need to give you the foundation that Martin Luther identified the papacy as a lineage of Nimrod. So the lineage of Semiramis, or what had been rebranded as Mary, is right there in this lineage. And so we see the priests of Dagon, right, are now the Roman Catholic Church. And everything's going good for them until the Protestant Reformation. And that was a big problem with them, because just before that, the Knights Templar were all done away with. They got caught off surprise. They said, we're never going to be caught off surprise again. So they create the Counter-Reformation, but they have to found a group to do that. And they founded the Jesuits. And so we find here at the time, the Order of the Jesuits was created to champion popery, and the Jesuits rapidly spread themselves over Europe, and went wherever they go, the Great Controversy tells us that popery followed. Now, there's just so many quotes about how evil the Jesuits are, how they're a military organization, how they are, horrendous people. There's so many different quotes around this. But Ellen White also tells us that, that this group pretended to be one people and were no different. So we even find how the Inquisition continued and even continues today. But this group called the Jesuits, we can find their doctrine online. And I'm going to skip over some of this here, but specifically I want to point out that they say in the Doctrine of the Jesuit Oath, it says, your duty is to be a spy and to integrate yourself into the confidence, the family circle of Protestants. Where? Among the schools and universities. Interesting. So the primary focus of the Jesuits is integrating into our schools. That is their focus. And so, would it be conspiratorial then to say that if their goal is to integrate themselves into our schools and universities, did they do that? Is there any influence of them? Or are they completely worthless, right? If their entire goal is to do this, would it make sense to say that maybe they're doing it? Ellen White is clear. It has ever been the policy of the papacy to sterilize the brains of teachers so that they cannot be impregnated with reform ideas. So they are the one creating our educational system with rote memorization, so that way we don't have another Protestant Reformation. The characteristics of a Jesuit school is all about using rote memorization to keep down free thought and clearness of judgment. Here we have this interesting stamp, higher education, and on it is the lamp of Aladdin, which is all about managing, ultimately, education. And so we start seeing this idea. And the Jesuits, their focus is hermeneutics, right? Philosophy, literary theory, right? Their target is educational systems to make the complicated, right? To make the simple complicated. And that's what's interesting, is that seems what we're at right now. It feels like things are so confusing, but why are they so confusing? Because they're intended to be. So would it be implausible to believe that the Jesuits are around us in our midst? Yeah. If their stated goal is to infiltrate our schools and churches, do we think that they did not succeed? But what can we prove? Could we prove that at a minimum, we have Jesuit-trained leaders in our schools and churches? Like, I'm not going to apply any labels to them other than just where their training is, which is a fact. So if we were to find that, according to Andrews University, we have people who became an ordained minister, 5 years afterwards, they then go and are trained at a Jesuit university, in fact, the most prestigious university, a Jesuit university, and then come back and are now applying this new hermeneutics that they learned, right? Now, again, I'm not saying that he is a Jesuit, but that's a fact that he's Jesuit trained, and he's learned from the Jesuits how to study and interpret the Bible, and is now preparing our Sabbath school lessons for Seventh-day Adventist World Church to study on Sabbath mornings. I think that's a little bit odd, but let's go into it. Is there anything impacted? What are the implications? And, when we get little doubts planted that maybe Paul did not write Hebrews, or maybe Ellen White is not as authoritative as she says, or, these little syncretic ideas planted about, not doctrinal statements, but through imagery and narrative, emotional framing, that this Madonna is, directing the viewer emotionally to the crucifix, right? This is the story that gets placed in here. It's Marian framing. But we find surely our fathers have inherited lies and things where there is no profit. Inherited lies such as those found in Questions and Doctrines. And oh yeah, remember Froom, who largely spearheaded Questions and Doctrines? Well, look up where he's buried, and you're going to find it's in Washington Cemetery in Messianic section B. Yeah, that's the thing. They don't just let anyone be buried in these sections, but you'll see on his grave, and while his grave seems to be being forgotten, his legacy is not. And here it is, Aladdin's lamp, the Jesuit symbol of higher education. So just do what you want with that, but understand that Satan's chief work is at the headquarters of our faith, and he spares no pains to corrupt men in responsible positions, persuade them to be unfaithful in their trusts. And so when something as simple as the nature of Christ is being disputed, maybe before you blindly spout things that have implications in Mariology, maybe you should think about that and maybe study to show yourself approved. Don't just blindly accept what you've been told in seminary school. That may be Jesuit teaching. It's not so hard. But Jesus warns us, unless we become like little children, seeing how simple the doctrine is, we'll never enter in the kingdom of heaven. If it gets complicated, maybe it's not of God. And so stop mindlessly consuming propaganda. And maybe it's time we start actually questioning the motives of those who are questioning our doctrines. I think we need to be thinking about what are the motives. It's time to wake up.